What's up, guys? Welcome into my full 32 team mock draft 1.0 for the 2025 NFL draft. I'm going to be going through every pick and telling you my thought process and what players I'm deciding between. Today, we're actually going through 2 rounds of the NFL draft. Let's go ahead and get right into it. Starting off right at the top, the Tennessee Titans kind of control this draft, and I think they're in a tough position here. Do they stay at number 1 and take Cam Ward? Or do they look to trade out of the pick? And in this mock, I am going to do a trade. The Giants are going to offer a first round pick in next year's draft and give up pick number 65 this year to come up to number 1, where they are going to take the best quarterback in the draft, Cam Ward. He's a perfect fit for what Brian DeBall is doing, and I think this pick makes too much sense. My next mock I'll do without trades, but for this one, I think this trade almost makes too much sense. Now, at number 2, I have the Cleveland Browns. These guys are in a tough position here. There are still some rumors that Shedeur Sanders could go here, and most mocks do have 2 QBs going in the top 3. But I think the Browns are still trying to land a veteran quarterback. I think we should keep an eye on Kirk Cousins eventually reuniting with Kevin Stefanski in Cleveland. I have the Browns taking the best player on the board here and pairing him across from Myles Garrett, Abdul Carter to the Cleveland Browns. The Titans then at number 3, they move back and grab who might be the best player on their board, Travis Hunter. I think that pick would make too much sense in this scenario, and that leaves the Patriots setting at number 4, and this is where I might pull off my first surprise pick of the draft. I think if 2 quarterbacks go in the top 3, then the Patriots have the easiest choice in the entire draft. They would just set at number 4 and take either Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter. With both of those players off the board, though, I think the Patriots are going to pivot to offensive line here. And while most people have the Patriots taking Will Campbell, I'm going with Armand Mimbu. He's going to come in and start at right tackle and help protect Drake May. Armand Mimbu, the right tackle out of Missouri, to the Patriots. And then Jacksonville on the board at number 5. This is probably one of the easiest picks in the entire draft. They need to upgrade the defensive line. And if Mason Graham is on the board, they're going to run up to the commissioner to turn that pick in. Mason Graham to Jacksonville. And this is where the draft really gets kind of interesting here. A lot of people are saying Ashton Jeanty to the Raiders. That makes a lot of sense. But I think the Raiders could go a number of directions here. Will Campbell also makes a lot of sense. I think Ashton Jeanty is an option here as well. Raheem Mostert does not stop them from taking a running back in round 1. They also could go with cornerback Will Johnson out of Michigan as well. So this is a tough one that could go a number of ways. I think these top 3 players on the board all make a lot of sense here. I think the Raiders grab another red zone target to help out Geno Smith and give them a second option in the passing game that'll help take some of the pressure off of Brock Bowers, and they can still land a running back in round 2, Tet McMillan, T-Mac, the wide receiver from Arizona, to the Raiders. And then we get to the New York Jets, a team that has a new quarterback in Justin Fields, and they're in the midst of a pretty good offseason. Now, they could go the route the Falcons did last year and still draft a QB. Shedeur Sanders is on the board here, but I think they're going to add talent around Justin Fields. If I didn't have Armand Mimbu going to the Patriots, he would make a ton of sense here. He would be another guy that would come in and start at right tackle for them. But with him off the board, I think this pick comes down to either Will Campbell or Tyler Warren. And Justin Fields has always had good connections with his tight ends, and Tyler Warren could be the best player on the board here. I think he would be a huge addition to the offense, and you could still address the offensive line in round 2. Tyler Warren, a new weapon for the New York Jets offense. Add him with Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, and all of a sudden you have some really exciting pieces in New York. And then next up, we have the Carolina Panthers. I think Tet McMillan would have made a ton of sense here. If he falls, he fits the Panthers perfectly. I do think this is a bit too high for Matthew Golden, though. It would have also been a good spot for Tyler Warren. With Tyler Warren and T-Mac both off the board, though, I believe the Panthers pivot here, and I think Jalen Walker makes a ton of sense. He can help out at linebacker, and he can get after quarterbacks. He's one of the best defensive players in the entire draft. Jalen Walker to the Panthers. And then we're going down to New Orleans for the Saints pick at number 9. And the Saints come in with a huge need at cornerback, so they could take the best corner in the entire draft. Whether they believe that's Jahdae Barron or Michigan's Will Johnson, they have their choice there. This could also be another potential landing spot for Shedeur Sanders, and I could also see them taking a long, hard look at Shamar Stewart. But this draft has a lot more pass rushers than it does corners, so to me, I think Will Johnson is a shoe-in for the New Orleans Saints. And then at pick number 10, we have the Chicago Bears. To me, I think the Bears could go a lot of directions here. Will Campbell would make sense, but with Joe Thuney on the roster, I think you wait on a left guard. So the top 3 options on the board right now for me would be James Pierce Jr. if you want to add an edge rusher, Malachi Starks if you want to get the safety of the future, or Ashton Jeanty, who could really carry the load on that offense and take a lot of pressure off Caleb Williams. This pick is up to Ben Johnson, but in this mock, I have the Bears taking Ashton Jeanty. And this leads us to the San Francisco 49ers. A couple of options here that make a lot of sense for the 49ers. They could bring in a left tackle to potentially groom underneath Trent Williams. So Kelvin Banks Jr. and Josh Simmons both make a lot of sense here. I think Kenneth Grant, the defensive tackle from Michigan, makes sense as well. I've seen Mike Green mocked to the 49ers a lot, but I have them taking a guy who's arguably the best corner in this draft, Jahdae Barron from Texas at number 11. And then at number 12, we have the Dallas Cowboys. I think a defensive tackle would make a ton of sense here. You could grab Derek Harmon or Kenneth Grant. Either one of those guys makes sense. Malachi Starks could make sense here. They could go into the trenches and grab Will Campbell or James Pierce Jr. across from Micah Parsons. I really like that as well. But I think adding another weapon on this offense almost makes too much sense. Luther Burden has been a guy that I've had mocked to the Cowboys probably all off season, but right now Emeka Egbuka is really picking up some steam. I think he's a guy who could play in the slot to start off. That allows CeeDee Lamb to move all over the offense and get his best matchups. Emeka Egbuka to the Cowboys, and they could still look to go to the well at running back in round 2. And now we get to the Miami Dolphins. A lot of options here. Malachi Starks makes a lot of sense. They just lost Javon Holland in free agency. They could also use someone on the offensive line. And to me, I think one that makes perfect sense here, it's a toss-up to me between either Kenneth Grant or Will Campbell. But I think if Will Campbell is still on the board at pick 13, and in this particular mock he happened to fall, Will Campbell to the Dolphins makes too much sense. After the Dolphins, we get to the Indianapolis Colts. And the Colts are another one of those teams that could go a number of ways here. They need a guard. They need a tight end. They need a defensive end. If Tyler Warren was still on the board, I think this would be his floor. But since he went a lot higher here, we have to look at other options. So it comes down to who's the best pass rusher available. You could also look at Kelvin Banks or Josh Simmons. And then this is a spot that makes a lot of sense for Colston Loveland, too, the tight end out of Michigan. I'm back and forth between Malachi Starks and Colston Loveland here, but I'm going to go with Colston Loveland. I think the Colts still have a good chance to add to the interior of the offensive line in round 2. And then we get to the Atlanta Falcons, where you just can't mess around here. Mike Green or James Pierce Jr., one of these two players makes sense. I personally like James Pierce Jr. better, but I have the Falcons selecting Mike Green, the pass rusher out of Marshall. And then we get to the Arizona Cardinals, a team that just landed Josh Sweat and Davlin Tomlinson and immediately upgraded their defensive line. But this is a team that could be looking to continue adding to the trenches. And when I'm looking through here, I think a guy that makes perfect sense would be Kenneth Grant or Derek Harmon. I'm going to go with Derek Harmon to the Cardinals because he brings more pass rush upside to the table. And then we get to the Cincinnati Bengals. This is a team that could also go a number of directions here. I think Jahdae Barron would have made sense. Tyler Warren would have made sense as well. And so would have Derek Harmon. But with all those players off the board, the Bengals are probably going to pivot to best player available. And you have to look at Malachi Starks in that situation. It comes down to whether or not the Bengals believe that Dax Hill can be their free safety of the future. They have a number of holes, though, and could go various directions. A couple of other guys to watch out for as well would be Nick Emanuware or James Pierce Jr. if they want to add another pass rusher. But to me, I think Kenneth Grant makes too much sense. To me, he would help immediately upgrade the Bengals' defensive line. Kenneth Grant to the Cincinnati Bengals. And then we get to the Seattle Seahawks, a team that just went in on Sam Darnold in free agency, but they just traded away DK Metcalf and they let Tyler Lockett walk away during free agency. A couple of options they could go here. Colston Loveland would make sense, but he just went off the board. Matthew Golden, the receiver out of Texas, makes a ton of sense. But what about Josh Simmons if you think he can be the left tackle of the future? Offensive line is a priority here. They could look at Gray Zabel. I also think Kelvin Banks Jr. makes a ton of sense here as well. But I think the Seahawks opt to bring in a field stretcher to help out big money acquisition Sam Darnold. And in that situation, Matthew Golden makes a ton of sense here. I wouldn't lock this in completely. I think they could take a center. They could take a pass rusher. There's a lot of options the Seahawks could go here, but I think Matthew Golden makes a ton of sense. And then we get to the Tampa Bay Bucks, a team that is re-upping with Baker Mayfield. They brought back Mike Evans, and they also managed to bring back Chris Godwin on a value contract. This is a team that is looking to win now and capitalize on Baker Mayfield's deal. I think they go best player available here, and the top three players on the board all make a ton of sense. They could choose Malachi Starks. They could choose James Pierce Jr., but pairing Jahad Campbell with that Todd Bowles defense almost makes too much sense. He would be an immediate impact player that could help this team out. I could see them going any one of these directions, but I'm choosing Jahad Campbell to the Buccaneers. And then we get to the Denver Broncos, and I have a pick here that just makes too much sense. Omarion Hampton is a guy with first-round talent. If he's still on the board here at pick 20, this is a guy who does remind me in ways of Javonte Williams, who the Broncos just let walk, but he's a guy who would immediately upgrade this offense. Give me Omarion Hampton to the Broncos. And this is where it gets interesting, guys. Everybody had to be wondering, where is Shedeur Sanders going to land? He has been falling in my mock draft. And at this point, if he's still on the board at pick 21, I think the Steelers would stop his fall, bring him into Pittsburgh, get him around a coach like Mike Tomlin, and there you have it, the quarterback of the future for the Pittsburgh Steelers, Shedeur Sanders. And that brings me to Jim Harbaugh and the Los Angeles Chargers. And this is a team that has to be thinking trenches, trenches, trenches. And one guy that would make a ton of sense here would be Colston Loveland, the tight end out of Michigan. If he's still on the board, this is probably where he would end up. But I had him going a little bit earlier in this mock. And I think there's a couple of directions they could go here. But with James Pierce Jr. still on the board at pick 22, I think this would be an absolute steal. James Pierce Jr. to the Chargers. And then I get to the Green Bay Packers, a team that probably needs to bring in another weapon for Jordan Love. Remember, Christian Watson might be out for most of the season. He's recovering from a torn ACL. Luther Burden would make a lot of sense here. Donovan Izaraku would make a ton of sense. And I also think this could be a landing spot for Shamar Stewart. This is a team that could gamble on Stewart's talent. But I have the Packers finally taking a wide receiver in round one, bringing in Luther Burden, the stud wideout from Missouri. And then we get to the Minnesota Vikings, a team that also would have made a lot of sense for Omarion Hampton. I think Kenneth Grant would make a ton of sense here. I think Walter Nolan actually fits this team a little bit, but with how much money they just spent on defensive tackle and free agency, I think this is a team that could go another direction here. And when you think about Brian Flores and his defense, you see a guy like Shamar Stewart, and this is a guy that Brian Flores could really fall in love with. I have the Vikings taking Shamar Stewart, the freak edge rusher from Texas A&M. Then we get to the Houston Texans, a team that I honestly don't know what they're doing right now. They really need to help out CJ Stroud. They just traded away their franchise left tackle. They also traded away a guard. This team needs help all over the offensive line, but they also could use some help at wide receiver as well. Stephon Diggs is leaving via free agency unless they can find a way to bring him back, and Tank Dell could be out for the whole season. So that a team that going into last year had a plethora of weapons at wide receiver is now hurting at the position. I think Gray Zabel would be a legit option here, but to me, I think it comes down to either Kelvin Banks Jr. or Josh Simmons. And I'm imagining that Josh Simmons has a huge pro day at Ohio State, and this is a guy who's going to be going up draft boards. He might not be available once we get to the draft at this spot, but right now at pick 25, Josh Simmons to the Texans makes a ton of sense. And then we have the Los Angeles Rams, another team that could go a handful of directions here. I think Walter Nolan is a good fit. I think Tyler Booker is a sleeper option right here. Jahad Campbell would make sense if he fell. And this is also a spot where you could consider Kelvin Banks Jr., but I have the Rams taking a player I really like. He's listed lower than I think he's going to go in the draft here. Maxwell Harrison, the cornerback out of Kentucky, he's an absolute stud and a guy that profiles as a lockdown type corner in the NFL. A great pick here by the Rams. And then we get to the Baltimore Ravens, and this is a team you know they like to take best player available. I think Maxwell Harrison would have made sense here. I think Malachi Starks makes sense. Definitely could see Ozzie Newsome looking at Malachi Starks and saying, that's the best player on the board. I got to take him. Kelvin Banks Jr. potentially maybe. And I think Walter Nolan also would make a ton of sense here. But then I scroll down the board a little bit, and one guy that I kind of have shoot in here, I think Tyler Booker right here at pick number 27, he fits the profile of what the Ravens do. This is a guy who makes too much sense, and I almost want to click this, but I'm going to pass on it. I think there's one player that makes a little bit more sense for the Ravens right now, Walter Nolan. But if somehow Nolan is not on the board, or if the Ravens took Tyler Booker here, it would not surprise me. But I have them taking Ole Miss defensive lineman Walter Nolan. And now we have it, the Detroit Lions. They lost both coordinators this offseason. Where are they going in this draft? They need an edge rusher, and this draft is loaded at edge rusher. I think Donovan Izaraku would make a ton of sense here, but I think they could look at Mykel Williams, and this is a guy who played through an ankle injury all season long, still set the edge very well. He's kind of a Dan Campbell type of player. I could see this one making a lot of sense. This is another spot where I could see Tyler Booker going in the first round. And I also think the Lions could use a wide receiver. If any of the wide receivers I have going earlier would fall to this spot, it would make a ton of sense. But I have the Lions taking Mykel Williams, the defensive end out of Georgia. And then we get to the Washington Commanders. This is a team that has a clear need on the board right now. They need an edge rusher. Yes, they could add a running back. They could add a guard. They could add a corner. There's a couple of other options they could go here. But when I'm looking at the board and I'm looking at this team specifically, one guy that's slept on and I don't hear talked about a lot is Texas A&M's Nick Scourton. This is a guy I believe has all the talent to be a first-round pick. All it takes is one team to fall in love with him here. And when it comes to the Commanders, I think they're going edge rusher at this spot. Yes, they could take Donovan Izaraku, but I think Nick Scourton is a guy that they have to watch out for. I have Nick Scourton going to the Commanders at pick 29. And I had to have at least one more sleeper, a guy that you won't see going in the first round of most mocks, and a guy I believe could very well go in the first round here. Now, when you're looking at the board, there are a couple of players that probably should be gone by now. Malachi Starks, Donovan Izaraku, another guy who fits a need here, Kelvin Banks, and even Gray Zabel. But I have the Buffalo Bills addressing a major need and taking one of my favorite sleepers in this year's draft, cornerback out of Florida State, Azariah Thomas. I really love this guy. He was awesome at the Senior Bowl, and he tore it up at the Combine as well. Keep an eye on this guy to end up going late in the first round. And then we get to the Kansas City Chiefs, and Malachi Starks almost makes too much sense here. I would hate to see it, honestly. They just lost Justin Reed in free agency, but they also have a huge needed edge as well, where Donovan Izaraku would make a ton of sense. And then they also just traded away their left guard, Joe Tooney, to the Bears. So this is another potential landing spot for Alabama's Tyler Booker. But they also need help at left tackle. And I think Kelvin Banks Jr. being on the board here almost makes too much sense here. Any one of these three players, I would not argue if the Chiefs took. But Kelvin Banks is a guy they could come in. They could try him at left tackle. They signed Jalen Moore on a 2-year prove-it contract. But Banks is a guy who can challenge at left tackle, and he can also swing inside to left guard. So either way, he's improving that offensive line. Kelvin Banks to the Chiefs. And then we get to the Philadelphia Eagles, and this is where the fall of Donovan Izaraku ends. He's a guy who could go much higher. He led the FBS with 17 sacks this year, and we know Howie Roseman loves to add to that defensive line. Malachi Starks is on the board here too. This one would be scary because we know the Eagles have all those Georgia Bulldogs on the defensive line, but I think Donovan Izaraku to come in, work behind Bryce Huff, and eventually be the guy who replaces Josh Sweat in Philly. Donovan Izaraku to the Philadelphia Eagles, and that wraps up the first round of the 2025 NFL Draft mock version 1.0. Now, I also did include a bonus second round of the mock draft here. Now, I didn't spend as much time with each team or each pick and position player needs, but I did add a second round for bonus here. I will say a couple of mistakes I made in this mock draft. My safeties fell a little bit too low. Nick Amanawari, the safety out of South Carolina, goes way, way lower than I think he will in the real draft. So that's something to keep in mind here. I have the Browns taking Jackson Dart. The Giants landed tackle Josh Connerly. I do like Jaden Higgins. Nice sleeper pick here. The Raiders come back and grab their running back in round 2, Quinshon Judkins. Gray Zabel goes off the board early on day 2. Malachi Starks falls to the Bears. Tyleik Williams to the Saints. The Bears land an edge rusher, Landon Jackson. I really like this tackle out of Minnesota. The Jets would bring in a guy who would come in and probably start at right tackle right away. Tyler Booker's fall finally ends at pick 43 to the 49ers. The Cowboys grab one of my favorite edge rushers in the draft, Princely Umanmielen, another edge rusher, Jack Sawyer. The Falcons replace Drew Dahlman with Jared Wilson. The Cardinals bring in some D-line talent. I really love Donovan Jackson. This guy's one of my favorite day 2 picks. JT Tui stays in the state of Ohio and goes to the Bengals. And then I finally have Nick Amanawari coming off the board, going to the Seahawks at pick 50. He's going way higher than this next month. There will be an adjustment in my next mock for sure. Travion Henderson to the Broncos, Braden Swinson, Xavier Watts, Trey Amos. I really like Mason Taylor, a stud tight end prospect. Kyle Kennard, Cam Williams, Tate Ratledge to the Ravens. This one's a nice pick, especially if they don't land Tyler Booker in round 1. Have a couple linebackers go off the board, and then end round 2 with even more defensive line talent, TJ Sanders and Alfred Collins. This is just mock draft 1.0. Let me know the picks you hate and the picks you like. This year's draft is extremely unpredictable. Outside of the top 5 picks, this draft is just wild. It's a deeper draft than normal years where you're still going to find a lot of first round quality players in round 2, but there's not as many top end blue chip talents. I'm not opposed to doing one of these live in the future as well. Let me know in the comments which picks you liked and which ones you hated. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more year-round NFL draft coverage.